Across Alberta, many towns began with the rail line, a few settlers, and the belief that something lasting could be built. In this Season 1 collection, we're looking back at 10 Alberta towns and the early stories that helped shape them. Some grew strong, some changed with time, but each one left its mark on the prairie. I would ask that you please consider subscribing and liking the video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hey, my name is Mike. Thanks for viewing, and let's get started. Heading south on Highway 21, and without really trying, the road falls in step with the railway. During the summer, this land softens. In the winter, it tells the truth. No crops, no colors, no distractions. Just distance, silence, and places that were built to endure both. Up ahead is Bashaw, a prairie town shaped by rails, road, and time. Now, towns like Bashaw don't appear randomly. They form where movement slows, where something we're stopping for takes shape. From the road, this isn't always obvious. Long before Bashaw existed as a town, this area was already being used. The land around Buffalo Lake was part of a much older human landscape. Indigenous peoples hunted buffalo here and used the lake and surrounding plains seasonally. By the 1870s, there was a sizable encampment on the northeast arm of Buffalo Lake, roughly 12 miles east and 4 miles south of where Bashaw would later stand. Made up largely of Métis and Indigenous families who hunted buffalo across the nearby plains. In 1870, the Hudson's Bay Company operated a trading post nearby. One of its factors, Francis Whitford, acted as both a fur buyer and an interpreter between Cree and English speakers. This area was active long before the railway or town sites arrived. However, it was not permanent in the way later settlement would be. As the buffalo disappeared and policies changed, these early concentrations of population faded. By the time Bashaw appeared, that early world had already receded. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, homesteaders began arriving in what is now known as the Bashaw district. This was not a mining area or a speculative land rush. Settlement here was agricultural from the start. Families broke land, built modest homes, and lived spread out across the countryside rather than cluster in town. One example often cited is Old Brasseth, who arrived in the district in 1909. Born in Norway in 1869, he had lived in Minnesota and Montana before coming north for health reasons. After a brief stay in Stettler, his family moved into the Bashaw district by horse and wagon. Their first home was a small log structure with a sod roof. During this period, mail and supplies had to be fetched from other communities. Children walked long distances to school across open fields, and winters were harsh enough that lunches froze before they could be eaten. This was life here before Bashaw existed as anything more than prairie grass. The land where Bashaw now stands was originally homesteaded by a Métis man named Joe Lewis. Now, according to local historical accounts, a poker game played sometime in the early 1900s became central to town's later development. One evening, Joe found himself involved in a serious card game. The game got heated and things weren't going his way. He soon ran out of cash. So he did what any good gambler would do. He put the title of his land into the pot for security. The next hand was dealt, and on the turn of a card, he lost. The quarter section eventually changed hands and was sold to Eugene Bashaw for $500. This story appears consistently in local history, but it should be understood as a community account rather than a single documented legal moment. What is clear is that Eugene Bashaw acquired the land that would later become Bashaw. At this point, there still was no town. That changed in 1909 when the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway was planning a line through central Alberta. Early plans suggested the line would pass through a nearby community called Jarvis, bypassing Bashaw's land altogether. It was at that point that Mr. Bashaw traveled to Camrose to meet with the railway officials. Local history credits him with striking a deal that redirected the line through his property instead. When rail construction reached the area in 1910, everything changed quickly. This was a defining moment. Bashaw exists because the railway came here. The first trains arrived in 1910. A station and a siding were established, and the area transformed almost immediately from scattered farms to a town site. This new settlement was incorporated as the village of Forester on August 18, 1911. But the name did not last for long because another Forester already existed in Saskatchewan. The name was changed in 1912 to Bashaw in recognition of Eugene Bashaw's role in developing the town and securing the railway. The post office opened on December 15, 1910, even before formal incorporation. On the prairies, a post office was a signal of permanence. Bashaw was no longer temporary. The year was 1911. Bashaw already had 22 businesses. These included general stores, hardware stores, lumber yards, blacksmith shops, barbers, restaurants, livery barns, and 2 doctor's offices. One can't forget the hotel, which became the social center of the town. The first grain elevator had a capacity of 40,000 bushels and stood on the site of what later became the Pioneer Elevator. Other elevators soon followed. A local newspaper, the Buffalo Times, began publication after the railway arrived. Bashaw was functioning exactly as intended, a rail-based agricultural service town. Social life in early Bashaw centered on necessity rather than leisure. Card games, dances, and gatherings were common, not for entertainment alone, but to manage isolation. Schools and halls doubled as community centers. Hotels served as gathering points for travelers, salesmen, and locals alike. One early hotel became well known for its bar. Accounts describe a bar with no chairs. If you wanted a drink, you bellied up to the counter. Beer and liquor sold for 25 cents a drink, and it was well known that traveling salesmen could use the display room downstairs to show their goods. In 1916, the hotel burned to the ground under what was described as suspicious circumstances. With it ended what some later accounts would call Bashaw's brief Wild West phase. Stories about horses being ridden into the bar and the occasional shootout are often told, but there's no solid documentation to support these accounts, placing them more in the realm of local folklore. Bashaw's growth was steady rather than explosive. Population figures reflect this pattern. Bashaw was not a boom town. It never collapsed. It expanded only as much as agriculture required. The town sat in the black soil zone, supported by mixed farming and livestock production, and this environment proved to serve the town well. By the 1950s, Bashaw had reached maturity. It had schools, a full range of services, and a stable population. The rail lines still defined the town's layout, and the grain elevators dominated the skyline. Roads followed the rail corridor, not the other way around. A mid-century civic description called Bashaw the best town on the GTP line between Edmonton and Calgary. Whether promotional or factual, it reflects how town saw itself at the time: established, well-settled, and complete. In 1959, the town became linked to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Alberta's history. Not because the crime occurred here, but because of how it unfolded afterward. In June of that year, 7 members of the Cook family were murdered in Stettler, Alberta. These victims included Raymond Cook, his wife Daisy, and 5 of their children. The scale of brutality of the crime shocked rural Alberta and drew intense attention from both police and the public. Suspicion quickly centered on Robert Raymond Cook. This was Raymond Cook's eldest son from a previous marriage. He was arrested and later sent to the Ponoka Mental Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, while the authorities determined how to proceed. On July 11, 1959, Cook escaped from the hospital in Ponoka. After stealing a vehicle and crashing it, he fled on foot into the countryside of central Alberta. With little information on his direction or his condition, police initiated an extensive search effort. Over the next 4 days, more than 100 police officers were involved, using patrol cars, foot searches, and aircraft to comb the farmland, coulees, and rural buildings. This manhunt created widespread anxiety across the region. Warnings circulated quickly through the small towns and farmsteads. Many farmers kept firearms loaded, and families remained indoors or close to home, anticipating the possibility of a violent confrontation. On July 13, 1959, Cook was discovered hiding on a farm near Bashaw. He was taken into custody without resistance. And for a brief period, Bashaw, normally known as a quiet agricultural service town, became the focal point of the province. This event stands out in the town's history precisely because it's so out of character with everything that Bashaw represents, before and after that summer. After the 1950s, Bashaw entered the same period of change faced by most prairie towns. Steam gave way to diesel, trucks took over the work once done by the rail, passenger rail service all but disappeared. Farms grew larger, yet they required fewer people. This was not a collapse, it was consolidation. As Bashaw moved into the later half of the 20th century, much of its early physical history wasn't removed, it was reused. The former jailhouse, built in 1915, now serves as town's museum. Once part of Bashaw's civic and law enforcement, it now holds photographs, artifacts, and records that document everyday life in town and the surrounding district. Its history kept where it actually happened. One can't forget the Majestic Theatre, also built in 1915. Constructed during Bashaw's early growth years, it's believed to be one of the last surviving wood-frame boomtown theatres in Western Canada. For decades, it served as a social anchor, a place for films, performances, and community gatherings. And there's the grain elevator. While most wooden elevators have disappeared all across Alberta, Bashaw's last wooden grain elevator was completed in 1983. It's privately owned and remains in operation, still doing the job this town was built to do. Now, of course, I know this doesn't cover everything about Bashaw. No single visit ever could. But if you're curious, you're welcome to come through here, walk the streets, talk to the people, and discover what I've missed for yourself. Bashaw wasn't built to be remembered. It was built to function. Some people ask me, Mike, what does a railway town look like when it goes bust? When it doesn't adapt to the railway leaving? Well, it looks like this. This is Bulwark, and this is its history. So let's go back to the early 1900s. This region was known as the Lindsville District, named after one of the first settlers, Thomas Lind. Farmers arrived with hope, drawn by cheap land and the dream of wealth and wheat. By 1911, the United Farmers of Alberta had already been organized locally, giving voice to those carving out lives on the open plains. Everything changed in 1914, the year the Canadian Pacific Railway extended a branch line west of Coronation, and it ran straight through this area. It was a game changer. With rail access came grain elevators, businesses, and people. The first elevator, National, went up that same year. Pioneer Grain followed in 1915, and in 1916, this area was renamed Bulwark, and a new post office marked town's official beginning. Growth came quickly for the region. United Grain Growers built their elevator here in 1917. North Star, it added a fourth in 1921, though it did burn down 2 years later in 1923. The final addition was the Alberta Wheat Pool elevator, and it was erected in 1927. The same year, Bulwark opened its school under District 4265. By the late 1920s, Bulwark was a working prairie hub. There were 2 general stores, along with a butcher, drugstore, blacksmith shop, a bank, a garage, lumberyard, and even a Chinese cafe. The United Church, built in 1928, became a focal point of town life. Community spirit ran deep. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, storm clouds began to build in the distance. 1929 brought the stock market crash, and with it, the closure of Bulwark's bank. Tragedy struck in 1936, when young Jimmy Blades drowned during a spring melt in a creek just outside of town. Just 2 years later, a massive hailstorm destroyed nearly all the local crops. The 1930s hit hard. Drought, dust storms, rock-bottom grain prices forced many farmers to the edge. But the town held together. Relief drives were organized. Neighbors helped neighbors. The spirit of the community did not break. When World War II began, Bulwark answered the call. Young men enlisted, like Tommy Murphy and Gregory Gordon. Sadly, like so many others, they never made it back home. By the early 1950s, Bulwark's future was growing uncertain. In 1951, the United Grain Grower elevator was dismantled. In 1956, a critical rail bridge at Lorraine was removed, cutting off the CPR's branch line from the east. By 1960, the school had closed. And in 1962, the railway pulled out entirely. With no way to ship grain, the elevators, well, they shut down. The United Church was moved to Brownfield in 1961. And the post office, Bulwark's final service, it was closed in 1965. The railway tracks have pulled out. The elevators are gone. Bulwark is now a ghost town. Yet the stories remain. Farmers, families, ball games, and long winters. Bulwark didn't survive. Yet its history deserves to be remembered. Some prairie towns began almost by accident. A railway siding was placed on a map. A few buildings gathered around it. A store opened, and soon a post office followed. And slowly a community took shape. But Daysland, well, it was different. It was not a place that simply appeared beside the tracks. Before there were proper streets, before the station became the center of daily life, before the grain elevators rose above the prairie skyline, Daysland had already been imagined. From the very beginning, it carried the ambition of becoming something larger than just another railway town. The story begins not with the train, but with the land. A huge block of land, and a bold purchase. One man looked across the open prairie and believed he could build a town where almost nothing stood. This is the story of Daysland, the town planned before it existed. The story of Daysland begins with E.W. Day. By the early 1900s, Day was no stranger to the West. He had been traveling through the country for roughly 20 years, watching how settlement moved, how railway lines shaped communities, and how land had become valuable almost overnight, if the right pieces came together. At that time, the Canadian Pacific Railway still held large amounts of land across the West. Railway land, government policy, immigration, and settlement were all tied together. The railway needed traffic. Settlers needed farms. Farmers needed a shipping point. And towns needed all of them to exist. In 1903, Day hired J. A. O'Neill Hayes of Wetaskiwin as a guide to show him the sections of land that he wanted to purchase. Then, in the early spring of 1904, Day made one of the largest individual land transactions recorded in the West. For $750,000, he purchased 12 townships from the Canadian Pacific Railway. This land would eventually include Daysland, Strome, and Killam. This area was still open prairie, waiting for survey lines, homesteads, roads, businesses, and of course rail connections to push future growth. Now, Day wasn't working alone. The Alberta Central Land Company was part of the larger plan. The land had to be sold, settlers had to be attracted, businesses had to be built, and most importantly, the railway had to come through this area. In May of 1904, Day and about 30 businessmen traveled in from Wetaskiwin. They invested in the area and prepared for the building of a town. But before town was built, came one of the most memorable moments in its early history. At a certain point on the open prairie, Day handed the reins to his 10-year-old son George and told him to drive the team straight ahead. He then told his son that he would be the first person to drive a team of horses down the main street of Daysland. No storefronts, no sidewalks, no station, no elevator row, no town at all. Just grass, soil, horses, and a father pointing into the future. In September of 1905, Alberta became a province. That same month, Day registered plans for the future town site of Daysland on Section 9, Township 45, Range 16, west of the 4th Meridian. Before the official founding of the town on October 1st, 1905, the Alberta Central Land Company, the Daysland Trading Company, the Board of Trade, and the retail merchants of the area had already been organized to colonize the area and build the town. That detail was important. Daysland was not waiting around to see what might happen. It was being prepared before the first rush of activity began. On October 2nd, 1905, the first freight train had arrived. Men came in from their homesteads, and the building of Daysland began. Daysland's first few months were fast-paced, rough, and full of motion. This was not yet a polished town. It was a construction camp turning into a business center while people watched. One of the first major business stories belonged to White and Orr. They began in a tent, selling hardware and general merchandise. Lumber was soon purchased for their building. It was teamed in from Camrose, and within days they had moved from a canvas tent into a newly framed store. On October 2nd, 1905, their first freight car arrived by a construction train, loaded with hardware, furniture, and supplies for a newborn town. They were part of a larger rush. W.P. Carner opened the first general store. J.E. Vandenberg arrived and quickly started a lumberyard. The Daysland Trading Company handled lumber and furniture. Contractors, carpenters, merchants, and suppliers all became part of the early push. By December 2nd, 1905, the CPR line was completed. That date opened the way for a larger flow of homesteaders and settlers. Now people could arrive by rail. Freight could come in. Farm machinery could be shipped. Household goods could be unloaded. Lumber, food, tools, furniture, and people could move through Daysland in a way that had not been possible before. In 6 months, most businesses and services had been established to the point that Daysland had become a village. Then, in 1906, the Angus Hotel opened. In a new prairie town, a hotel was much more than just a place to catch a night's sleep. It was a dining room, a meeting place, a business center, and often the first roof over the heads of people arriving with no house waiting for them. The Angus Hotel also became the first home of the Merchants' Bank of Canada, and R.J. Dinning was the first manager. He also noted that the hotel had been built using green lumber. As that lumber dried, cracks opened in the walls. Through those cracks came the prairie cold. But he refused to leave, and the bank, well, it still operated. During the busy summer of 1906, thousands of immigrants moved through with their belongings. If the situation required it, the bank opened as early as 6 in the morning and stayed open until late into the evening. That image is one of the strongest in Daysland's story. A plank counter, a hotel still drying and shifting, settlers arriving with everything they owned, money, land, risk, and hope, all passing through a small space at the top of the stairs. Then came the winter of 1906-07. It was one of the worst winters anyone had seen. Snow laid 5 to 6 feet deep across the open prairie, with some areas recording snow drifts up to 10 feet high. There were no proper roads yet, only rough trails cut through the snow. Feed was hard to get to the livestock, and that winter many animals were lost. By then, Daysland was becoming an important supply point along the new railway. Freight arrived by train, but much of the country beyond still depended on horse teams and sleighs to make deliveries. Even rough and unfinished, this young community was already serving a much larger district. In April of 1907, Daysland became a town, and Edgerton W. Day was chosen as its first mayor. This new town's first council wasted little time getting to work. Committees were formed for finance, fire, water and light, health, markets, immigration, public works, property, licensing, and policing. The council also authorized the borrowing of $5,000 from the Merchants' Bank to pay for the improvements. The district around Daysland was known for its rich black soil, clay subsoil, poplar, and willow bluffs. Farmers grew wheat, oats, barley, and flax, while others turned to livestock, dairy, and mixed farming. There was abundant water below ground, and coal for heating could be hauled in from the Battle River area. For these settlers, that was all they needed. By 1907, the surrounding farms were already producing enough grain that they needed proper storage and a way to ship their product to markets beyond town. That year, the Alberta Pacific Elevator Company opened in Daysland with B.M. Pauls as manager. The first to bring in his grain for market was brought in by J.E. Vandenberg, Alberta red winter wheat, weighing 63 pounds to the bushel. The land was beginning to answer back. (1908). That year's success brought pressure. Farmers and grain dealers could not get enough rail cars. They needed another 130 cars, but only 45 had arrived. The grain was ready, the cars were not. For a prairie town, that was more than just an inconvenience. A crop could only become income once it could leave by rail. The shortage slowed business, and town councils sent appeals to the CPR. It was an early reminder that the railway gave Daysland opportunity, but it also controlled how quickly that opportunity could move. By 1914, Daysland had 4 elevators in operation: Burrard, Imperial, West Coast, and Alberta Pacific. Wheat, barley, oats, and flax all moved through town. Oats alone counted for over 300,000 bushels. These elevators became the skyline of a working prairie town, and for some farmers, reaching them was still a long trip. Grain had to be hauled into town, often by sleigh in the winter. Dan Rabbit, an elevator agent, remembered one evening when 56 loads were waiting outside in the cold. He and his assistant worked through the night so the grain could be unloaded and the teams could begin the long trip home. That scene says more than numbers ever could. A long winter's night, lit by lantern light, horses waiting in the cold, men outside a wooden elevator while the rest of the town slept. Daysland was no longer just a planned town. It had become a working center, and farms fed the town served the farms, and the railway carried their work to the wider world. As town moved beyond its raw beginning, the story became less about arrival and more about endurance. The railway had come, the farms were producing, the elevators were busy. Now town had to become more than just a place of business. It had to become a community. One early sign came in 1907, when a meeting was held in the pool room of the Angus Hotel to organize a volunteer fire brigade. 52 men agreed to serve, officers were elected, a temporary fire hall was built, and the next year a fire bell was purchased. The brigade protected the town, but it also became part of town life. The annual Firemen's Ball grew into one of the largest social events of the year. Around that same time, telephone service began reaching the area, with rural lines starting to push into the district. The farms were still miles from town, but people were becoming easier to reach. In 1909, the community took another practical step with the opening of the Daysland Creamery. There were around 400 dairy cows in the area, and farmers needed a place to process local production. Stock was sold, a company was formed, and a site was purchased near the old ice house on the south side of the tracks. The creamery opened on June 7, 1909, with W. W. McGregor as buttermaker. Farmers then reported how many cows they were milking, where they lived, and how far they were from the nearest trail. From that, creamery routes were organized. The first churning produced nearly 500 pounds of butter. It was a small beginning, but it showed where the town was headed. Daysland was no longer only moving grain, it was becoming the center of a broader farm economy. In 1919, the community turned toward a new gathering place. A meeting was held in a little church to discuss building a community hall. Shares were sold, and before the meeting ended, 48 shares had already been purchased. The building chosen was the livery barn. A building once tied to horses, wagons, and travel was being remade into a place of meetings, dances, concerts, and community life. It's now the 1920s, and Daysland has moved far beyond its construction camp beginning. In 1924, the Renfrew Hotel was built, later known as the Daysland. It was described as well-kept, steam-heated, with electricity, furnished rooms, modern beds, and hot and cold running water, as well as good meals. That was a long way from the early days of plank counters and temporary spaces. The 1920s also brought new families to the area. One account remembered the Taylor family arriving from England with 10 children. Neighbors had meals ready so quickly that the family was eating breakfast 15 minutes after reaching Daysland. That small moment says a lot. By then, this was not just a rail point, not just a business venture, not just a town site on paper. It was a place where people helped each other begin again. And in 1926, an agreement was signed for an electric light transmission line. By then, the first great stage of Daysland's story had passed. The town had stores, elevators, hotels, banks, schools, a newspaper, a fire brigade, a creamery, telephone service, electric light, a community hall, and a farm district tied closely to its streets. Town did not become the large center some early promoters may have imagined, but it became something more important to the people who lived there. It became useful, it became dependable, it became necessary. Across the prairie, many towns began with big hopes. Some disappeared, others changed, grew quieter, or settled into a different role. Daysland endured because it had reason to. It served the farms around it. It gave families a place to trade, gather, worship, learn, ship grain, and build a common life. And even today, beneath the quiet streets, the older story, well, it's still there. And that's what gives this place meaning. So thank you, Daysland, for carrying the story forward and for writing another chapter in the long story of Prairie Pride. Donalda sits quietly on the rim of a wide coulee, the kind of place that feels suspended in time. You could drive right past it and never guess the stories that are tucked away in its hills, its streets, and in the hearts of those who live here and those who once lived here. Now, Donalda is no ordinary village. It's one with deep roots, a colorful past, and a lamp that can be seen for miles. Settled largely by Norwegians, the village began in 1909 as Eidsvold. But 2 years later, it was renamed Donalda, named after Donalda Crossway, niece of Sir Donald Mann, a powerful force behind the Canadian Northern Railway. When the CNR came through in 1911, Donalda came alive. Population 200. Donalda didn't grow in isolation. It was surrounded by hard-working homesteaders. These families lived on quarter sections, raising crops and livestock, braving long winters and dry summers. These surrounding homesteads formed the backbone of Donalda's economy. Farmers came into town to ship grain, buy supplies, sell cream, pick up mail, and catch up on the local news. Their presence kept the town's businesses running, week after week, season after season. Long before Donalda became a village, the land around Buffalo Lake was part of a vital travel and hunting corridor for several indigenous nations, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and Métis. These groups followed the great bison herds while moving with the seasons. The area was ideal for setting up temporary camps near the water, finding shelter, and using the many lookout points for scouting the buffalo. The surrounding coulees and hills made the area ideal for both travel and concealment. Meeting Creek, which still runs near Donalda today, was a common gathering place. Here, Cree and Blackfoot bands often crossed paths, sometimes to trade, sometimes to clash. Over the years, remnants of the past have surfaced. Burnt wagon wheels, a muzzleloader buried near Boss Hill, even a shallow grave was discovered. Quiet clues to a time before towns and railways. This land was never quiet. It was never empty. It was full of life, movement, and a deep history, long before Donalda had a name. Life on the prairie was never easy. The winter of 06-07 is still legendary. Snow came in November and stayed until spring, piling 4 feet deep, drifting to 10 feet. That winter, temperatures hit 60 below. Foot travel? Impossible. Snowshoes became something you wore every day and everywhere. And when the 1930s rolled around, things didn't get any easier. The dirty 30s brought drought, dust storms, and hard times. Kids wore dresses sewn from flour sacks. Some didn't have proper shoes and instead wrapped rubber from old tire tubes around their feet. Yet still they went to school, some riding in horse-drawn school vans, others by foot. One Sunday afternoon in 1935, a hailstorm tore through town, smashing every west-facing window and flattening gardens and fields for miles. You could hear the roar before you saw the damage. The hardware store worked overtime, cutting glass for weeks. In those days, prairie kids were resourceful. They'd cast their own lead soldiers from melted-down car batteries in fires built by the roadside. Each kid kept a personal can of molten lead and took turns pouring it into molds. This continued all summer long. Pete, the neighbor, well, he was concerned they'd burn the town down. And you know, he wasn't wrong to worry. Entertainment in Donalda wasn't fancy, but it sure was memorable. Every Tuesday evening, just before supper, you'd hear it. The clang of a handbell and the shouts from kids running down Main Street. "Show tomorrow night! Come one, come all!" That was the official movie announcement. No posters, no ads, just a couple of loud kids and a whole lot of excitement. By Wednesday night, Town Hall was packed. Now the film might be grainy, and the reel might even skip, but nobody cared. For an hour or two, you could forget about the cows, the chores, and your cold feet. It was picture night in Donalda, and that's all that mattered. That same hall pulled double duty. It hosted dances, school plays, community suppers, and once a traveling show with trained dogs, monkeys, and yes, even a bear. This was prairie entertainment at its finest. If you couldn't go to the big city entertainment came to you. In the winter, the outdoor rink beside the creamery was the place to be. But the warming shack, well, that was another story. It had a pot-belly stove that almost never stayed lit. One night, tired of freezing toes, somebody dumped a can of gasoline in the stove. Well, it lit all right. It almost launched straight through the window, sending soot, stovepipes, and skates flying in every direction. Back when Donalda was finding its stride, it wasn't just the village that kept things moving. It was the web of stores that surrounded it. Places like Norbo, Ferry Point, Hayes Brothers, and Halseth's Economy Store dotted the prairie like little lifelines. These stores would sell you just about anything. Nails, lantern wicks, bolts and clothes, even green coffee beans. Of course, you'd have to be willing to roast and grind them yourself. These stores weren't just for shopping. They were a place where people gathered. Some hosted community events, one through a proper prairie sports day complete with horse races, a cowboy tug-of-war, and to top it off, a brass band. At the heart of it all was Donalda's post office, one of the village's first institutions. For 36 years, it was run by Mrs. Otteson, who also operated the town's telephone switchboard from her front room. Back then, calls were patched in by hand, and her operating hours were officially 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. But if there was trouble, Mrs. Otteson would pick up and patch you through. By the 1960s, Donalda had changed. The grain still moved and the train still ran, but the crowds were getting smaller and the train station was getting quieter. In 1967, Ted Rogers, the last station agent, stayed on for a few final months, not to sell tickets or sort freight, but just to keep the fire lit and the waiting room toasty warm. He called it babysitting, but really, he was helping close the chapter of a long and loyal era. But even as one light dimmed, another began to shine. In the year 2000, Donalda unveiled its most iconic symbol, the world's largest oil lamp. At 42 feet tall, made of steel and fiberglass, it towers above the coulee like a prairie lighthouse, part monument, part memory. It's more than just a roadside oddity. It represents the warmth, resourcefulness, and endurance of a community that's always found a way to light its own way forward. Right across the street from the lanterns sits the Donalda District Museum, home of over 1,500 antique lamps collected and donated by Don and Beth Lawson. Step inside and you'll find a glowing timeline, lamps from the 1600s to the 1960s, along with artifacts that tell the wider story of Donalda, such as homesteading, railroading, farming, and family life. Today, Donalda is quieter than it once was. The trains no longer stop, the storefronts have thinned, and many of the old voices have faded into memory, but the village still stands, steady, proud, and full of stories. To understand the soul of this community, we have to look back over 300 years to a story that began a world away. Before Ferintosh was a name on the Alberta map, it was a legend in the Scottish Highlands. To an 18th century Scotsman, the word Ferintosh didn't just mean a place, it meant whiskey. It started with a rebellion in 1689. Jacobite forces burned the Ferintosh estate of Duncan Forbes to the ground. In compensation, the Scottish Parliament granted Forbes a unique privilege, the right to distill spirits on his land, completely tax-free. While others were taxed heavily, the Ferintosh region thrived. It became the whiskey capital of Scotland, producing over 100,000 gallons a year. It was so famous that the poet Robert Burns lamented its loss when the government cancelled the privilege in 1784. The distilleries went cold, but the name survived. The legend was carried to the New World in the memory of Dr. J.R. MacLeod, a member of Alberta's first legislature. He hadn't forgotten his ancestral home and that very same district in Scotland. In 1910, a new settlement on Little Beaver Lake, originally called Lassen, was struggling with an identity crisis. Its mail was getting mixed up with another town's. They needed a name that carried weight, a name with history. And so Dr. MacLeod planted the legacy of the Highlands into the fertile soil of central Alberta. The village of Ferintosh was born. It's 1909. The prairies are slowly waking. The old buffalo trails, once so deeply worn into the earth, are quietly disappearing now, fading back into a wide sea of grass. In their place comes something swifter, something louder, something more powerful: steel. The Grand Trunk Pacific Railway is drawing its long path from Tofield to Calgary. They are not merely just laying rails across the open land. They are building and shaping the future. And along those lines, they are looking for places to rest. They soon find one on the peaceful shores of Little Beaver Lake, a still point where the prairie meets the quiet water, chosen to become the next small heartbeat along the way. The settlement's first name is Lassen, honoring J.H. Lassen, the local homesteader whose land was sliced in two by the new tracks. But as the rails go down, the town's ambition goes up. By January 9th, 1911, the village incorporates. It sheds the name Lassen and takes the historic mantle of Ferintosh. The heartbeat of this new village was the railway station. It was completed in June 1911 for the exact sum of $2,156. The little station rose as a quiet beacon for the young settlement. It was a handsome building, simple yet graceful, a 1.5-story wooden-framed structure, crowned by a gentle bell-cast hip roof, shaped to sweep the prairie rain well clear of waiting passengers. However, Ferintosh wasn't content with just being a whistle stop. 3 local investors, William Wilson, J.H. Lanson, and James Townsend, had a vision that is nothing short of audacious. They took one look at the deep, clear waters of Little Beaver Lake. Well, they didn't see a farm slough. They saw a destination. They named this stop the Banff of the North. Yes, it sounds incredible today, but in 1910, this was a serious mission. While Banff was the playground for the rich in the Rockies, Ferintosh was to be the playground for everyone else. To make it happen, they formed the Little Beaver Lake Hotel Company. They capitalized it with $25,000, a fortune in those days. Then they set out to build a legend. Their masterpiece was the Livingston Hotel. Opened in 1912, this 3-story giant dominated the skyline, boasting nearly 60 rooms, full room service, and an upscale bar that stocked the finest spirits. This was no rough pioneer roadhouse. It was a luxury hotel designed to rival the best in Edmonton. The crowds soon followed. The railway ran special excursion trains, transporting weekenders from Camrose and Edmonton directly to the station. Passengers stepped off the train and walked just a few hundred yards to find themselves at a bustling resort. By 1912, bathhouses dotted the lakeshore, and the water came alive with canoes and regattas. The Banff of the North. Yes, it was a beautiful dream, but in 1915, reality came knocking. Alberta had decided to go dry. Prohibition had arrived, and with it, the lifeline of the great Livingston Hotel was severed. The investors had bet everything on luxury. Prohibition took effect July 1st, 1916, and a high-end hotel without a bar was a ship without a sail. The crowds eventually dwindled, and the train stopped delivering the weekend tourists. The hotel, once the jewel of the line, was sold for taxes. It was dismantled piece by piece. The timber that once sheltered the rich was hauled away, leaving only a ghostly reminder of the ambition that built it. Yet Ferintosh survived. When the tourists vanished, the town endured, stripping away the resort's veneer to reveal a gritty, hard-working village underneath. Just 3 years earlier, by the end of 1912, Ferintosh was already a self-sufficient world. 2 livery stables and a pair of blacksmiths kept the horses shoed and the wagons rolling. Town boasted a creamery, a lumber yard, and even its own jail, a sturdy reminder that law and order was necessary, even in paradise. And as the playful echoes of the lake faded, the roar of agriculture took over. The grain elevators became the new castles of the community, rising high above the flat prairie to boast the town's true wealth. They weren't just storage bins. They were the heartbeats of the local economy. Come harvest time, lines of wagons stretched down the road, their boxes overflowing with the prairie gold, waiting to deposit the season's labor into the bellies of those wooden giants. By the late 1920s, those wooden giants were holding up to 400,000 bushels a year, a staggering river of gold flowing from those local farms. The era of the resort was over. This was the era of harvest, where the wealth of the town was no longer found in its hotel, but in its soil. The town had settled in to a busy, steady rhythm, particularly down at the gravel pits. The Ferintosh Gravel Company was in the middle of transforming the industry, moving away from the old ways of doing things. In the early years, the work was defined by simple manual labor, with men and horses hauling the gravel by hand. But by 1930, the operation had modernized. Steam shovels were brought in to take over the heavy lifting. This was a necessary shift, allowing the company to keep pace with the needs of a growing province. On Main Street, the horse era was giving way to the engine. The premier garage, built by Fred Graff in 1925, became the new hub. In those days, getting fuel, well, it was a chore. Fred had to drive all the way to Camrose to haul back full 45-gallon drums of fuel just to keep the local cars running. Also during this time, the village's soul transformed as the rowdy hotel bar gave way to faith. Anchored by the 1916 Zion Lutheran Church and the massive 1,000-seat tabernacle built in 1928, Ferintosh became a spiritual hub. Alongside the new Alberta Bible Institute housing, these landmarks marked a distinct shift from earlier festivities to a new lasting foundation of dedication. In the life of a prairie town, time is something that you cannot stop. Ferintosh followed that familiar prairie pattern: growth, contraction, and adjustment. As the frantic energy of the pioneer years had moved on, town began to breathe again. A resort town, well, that dream had passed. The roaring machinery of the grain elevators eventually fell silent as well. While most of the buildings have changed, the heartbeat of the community did not. It simply found a new rhythm. Today, the town is powered by connection. Look at the Battle River Gas Co-op. In a world of massive corporate utilities, this local success story stands out, serving the region with the same spirit of independence that brought the first settlers here. And hospitality never left either. While the massive resort is a memory, the Ferintosh Hotel remains the cornerstone of Main Street. It's a place where neighbors still gather to share a meal and raise a glass, proving that you don't need a luxury title to be a welcoming home. History loves symmetry. In the boom year of 1912, when the excursion trains were running, the population of Ferintosh hit nearly 200 souls. War came, depression hit, and for decades it seemed the number would never be reached again. But look at the census today. In the last 5 years, something quite remarkable has happened. The population has been steadily ticking upward. Today there are roughly 200 people calling Ferintosh home once again. In a quiet way, the number has returned to where it once stood. We are back where we started, not with a roar, but with a whisper of resilience. Today, families are making their way back, drawn by the stillness of the campground and the winding trails around Little Beaver Lake, escaping that relentless noise of the cities that they once flocked to. "300 years ago, in the smoke of the Scottish Highlands, the name Ferintosh became a legend because of a privilege, a tax exemption for whiskey. The privilege was taken away, but today, in the clear air of central Alberta, we have found a new privilege. It has nothing to do with tax-free whiskey. It isn't about being the Banff of the North. The privilege of Ferintosh today is the privilege of a quiet life. It is the privilege of walking into the hotel for a meal with friends. It's the privilege of watching the sun set over Little Beaver Lake, knowing that over 100 years ago, this community has weathered every storm and is still standing. The distillery fires are long cold. The resort, well, it's gone. The people, they're home. This is the legacy. This is Ferintosh. Districts, communities, and towns on the prairie did not begin with buildings. They began with a journey, and a long one at that. In the early 1900s, if you were heading into the open country east of here, this was as far as the railway would take you. Welcome to Wetaskiwin. Although I should add that in 1906, a branch line was constructed between Wetaskiwin and Camrose, also providing connecting passenger service to Red Deer. The line was extended to Hardisty in 1907 and Saskatoon in 1910, creating a direct link with Winnipeg. Noting this, our story starts in 1904, prior to the extension of the rail line eastward. Trains arrived on the regular, carrying settlers in waves, families, laborers, young men traveling alone. They'd step down onto the platform with everything they owned: trunks, bundles, tools. Some stayed and became locals to the area, but most didn't. They gathered supplies, asked questions, found transportation, and prepared to head out again. Wetaskiwin wasn't the destination, it was the starting point. From here they left by wagon, horse, bicycle. Some even walked towards the land and community that awaited them. Some chose to settle near Killam, heading east from here into nothing but open prairie, wild and unforgiving, yet full of hope. They didn't arrive all at once, and they didn't all come from the same place. They came from Ontario, from the United States, and from Europe, each with their own reasons, each with their own expectations, most with very little money and no valuables, and no clear idea of what waited for them beyond the last rail stop. What follows comes from the diary of two brothers, William and John Hampshire. In May of 1904, they left Liverpool aboard the SS Vancouver. The crossing itself was uneventful. The accommodations were a little cramped, but comfortable enough. With little to do during the long days at sea, there was time to think. about the journey, and about the life they hoped was waiting. They eventually landed in Quebec City, and their first impression of Canada was mixed. Quebec City felt old and rough, muddy streets, narrow walkways, and French was spoken almost everywhere. Their next stop was Montreal, and it felt different, busier, more practical, a place that seemed to be moving somewhere. From there, they traveled west by rail, farther and farther into the interior until the tracks finally ended in Wetaskiwin. From this point on, the rest of the journey would be made by road, by wagon, and on foot, out across the open prairie, towards land that had yet to become a town called Killam. With heavy loads and difficult conditions, most settlers typically covered only 10 to 15 miles in a day. The trip from railhead to homestead could take about a week, depending on weather and ground conditions. The wagon they boarded was narrow and 11 feet long, with 3 seats and springs mounted under the benches instead of the frame. The fare was $1 per day, and each passenger was responsible for their own food. Mud holes swallowed the wheels. Creeks were crossed without bridges. Nights were spent in haylofts, tents, or whatever shelter they could find. They lost their way more than once. Section pegs were difficult to read, trails often disappeared altogether, and mosquitoes made sure sleep never came easy. Once they reached their plot of land, the journey was over. But the work, well, it had just begun. Yes, they stayed, called the area home, and took their place in a shared effort of building a life and contributing to the community. Many arrived with little more than what they could carry. Food supplies were limited, as food preservation wasn't yet possible. When it came to food rationing, there was no margin for mistakes. Until the land could be broken, gardens planted, and livestock established, newcomers often depended on those who had arrived before them. For most of the early settlers who came here, that experience was common, and that's when the community often rallied. Help came quickly. A meal shared, a place to sleep, seed lent out so crops could be planted and farm work would later be exchanged. It wasn't charity so much as a necessity. Everyone understood how quickly circumstances could change, and the community needed to stick together to succeed. Once the land was claimed, shelter came first. Not proper houses, but whatever could be built quickly with what was at hand. Sod shacks rose straight out of the prairie grass. Slabs were dug from nearby sloughs and stacked into thick walls. Where timber could be found and hauled in, log houses followed. Framed houses came later, when lumber became more accessible due to the railway pushing farther east. Winters were probably the biggest challenge. Fuel was scarce, and coal often had to be hauled long distances by wagon or sleigh. Wood was cut wherever it could be found. Food came largely from whatever settlers could grow, gather, hunt, or preserve. Gardens in the summer, berries in season. Wild game came when it could be taken, and careful planning was key to making supplies last through the long months ahead. In 1911, the settlers tried something that revealed a great deal about how they survived and how they supported one another. They formed what was called a beef ring. Each family would contribute an animal in turn. The meat was weighed carefully, divided evenly, and priced the same for everyone. No one made a profit. No one went without. Everyone shared in what was available. This was one of the keys to their survival. It was a practical solution born of necessity, and it reflected a quiet understanding that survival on the prairie was rarely a solo effort. That cooperative, matter-of-fact sense of fairness would shape what came next, because by the time the railway reached this section of the prairie, the community had already existed. Killam didn't appear randomly, it formed where people were already stopping. By 1906, settlers were already spread across the district, hauling supplies east from Wetaskiwin and beginning the slow work of turning prairie into farms. That year, Killam was incorporated as a village, even before the railway fully defined its future. The town took its name from Albert Clements Killam, Canada's first railway commissioner. A subtle signal that the rail access wasn't incidental here. It was expected. The post office opened on March 1, 1907, giving the settlement official recognition and a sense that it was here to stay. It meant regular mail service, reliable records, and a place where land transactions and government business could finally be handled locally. When the railway arrived shortly after, Killam shifted from a stopping point to a distribution center. Grain elevators rose beside the tracks, functional, dominant structures that shaped the town's skyline and its economy. Farmers who once moved grain long distances by wagon could now ship it efficiently, and Killam had now become a grain service hub. By 1910, the town already had a hotel, general goods stores, a butcher shop, a blacksmith shop, a lumber yard, and a defined business street facing the railway. The population here rose in a steady manner. These numbers are important because they tell the story of a town that didn't boom or bust, but endured. Killam became a service town. This was where families came for schooling, medical care, worship, supplies, council decisions, and social life. A school district was organized almost immediately after incorporation. As enrollment grew, facilities expanded, drawing in students from surrounding farms, tying rural life directly to the town. Churches followed the settlers. Swedish Baptist, Methodist, Anglican, and the Roman Catholic congregations all established early roots here, shaping both spiritual life and social networks. Utilities arrived gradually, and often through local effort. As an example, electrical power reached Killam in 1928, telephone in the early 1930s. Rural mail routes began in 1922, delivering far more than just mail. Groceries, medicine, cream, and everyday supplies traveled with the carrier, often the only regular link between isolated farms and town. During the Great Depression, when telephone service was threatened with cancellation, residents responded by forming the Killam Mutual Telephone Company in 1935, one of the earliest cooperative telephone systems in the province. The lines were maintained by residents themselves until the service stabilized years later. After the Second World War, Killam continued to invest in itself. The Killam Memorial Community Centre was built through volunteer labor as a living memorial to those who served. When it burned to the ground in January 1960, embers landed blocks away. By 1961, a new concrete arena stood ready. As population grew, infrastructure followed. Water systems were expanded through the 1960s, improving both daily life and fire protection. Streets were upgraded, services extended, and the town steadily took on responsibilities that had once been handled informally. By 1965, Killam was officially elevated from village to town status. In many ways, it was simply formal recognition of what already existed, a place that functioned as the administrative and commercial heart of the district. When highway plans threatened to bypass Killam entirely, the issue went far beyond routing. It became a question of survival. Council understood what a bypass could mean for a prairie town. It meant fewer people stopping, fewer businesses surviving, and a slow hollowing out of Main Street. So they pushed back. Through meetings and negotiations, the route was realigned along the north edge of town, keeping Killam connected rather than passed over. And in 1962, Main Street was paved, a major undertaking for a small town. Construction crews dug several feet down, tearing up the old surface in a matter of weeks. As they worked, they uncovered remnants of the earlier infrastructure beneath the street, traces of Killam's earliest lighting systems, old piping, and wooden sidewalks that had once linked the town's first businesses. It was progress built directly on top of old history. By the time paving was finished, Main Street wasn't just smoother, it was a clear signal that Killam intended to remain a place where people passed through and not around. The community here also produced people who carried its influence far beyond town's limits. Former NHL head coach Bill Peters spent formative years in Killam, shaped by the same local rinks and community leagues before going on to coach at the highest level. Clifford Still, a famous North American painter, lived just outside of Killam in the 1920s and the early 1930s. While there, he sketched grain elevators, rail lines, and the open prairie. Long before national recognition, Charles Stewart homesteaded near Killam and served locally before going on to become the third premier of Alberta, serving from 1917 to 1921. Killam wasn't built by chance. It wasn't defined by any single industry or moment. It was built on cooperation, by persistence, by people who rebuilt after fires, organized when services failed, and continued to show up year after year. Killam didn't just survive the prairie, it learned how to function on it, and that, more than any number or date, is what still defines the town today. The year was 1891, and the railway had finally reached this part of the prairie. And almost overnight, everything changed. Not because a town had suddenly appeared, but because people started arriving to the area. Now, there wasn't much here at first. No proper station, no streets, no real sense of a town yet. Just a rail line, and what amounted to a station that looked more like a boxcar sitting in seclusion at a siding. If you stepped off the train in those early years, you weren't stepping into a town. You were stepping into what was considered low ground. This area was wet, soft, and often difficult to cross. The mud here had gotten bad enough that the railway had to build a wooden plank walkway out past the tracks, just so people could reach the buildings on the west side of the rails without sinking up past their ankles. And that's how this place started, not with a main street, but with a plank path, a rough station, and a rail line cutting through a stretch of difficult ground. The name Millet didn't come from a map or a plan. It came from a person. As the railway pushed further north, Sir William Van Horn turned to Father Lacombe for help in naming the stations along the line. Lacombe chose the name Millet in honor of his friend August Millet, a canoeman, a fur buyer. August was a trusted companion who had traveled with him on the western trails. Now, the name wasn't what shaped this place. It was the railway. The Calgary and Edmonton Railway Company was granted 6,400 acres of land for every mile of track it built. So that meant the line wasn't just passing through. It was laying out the foundation for settlement. And by the early 1900s, that rough little station was replaced. First, a small platform was built, and then in 1907, a larger two-story station was erected, and that building would soon become the center of everything. Mail and freight arrived here daily, like tools, coal, food, and farming supplies. Local farmers were now provided with a new opportunity. They could bring their goods here to be shipped out to just about anywhere in the world. And upstairs, the station agent lived with his family, working around the constant rhythm of trains coming and going. You could feel the railway here, not just in the movement, but in the way the whole place was organized around it. Now, it should be noted that by the time the settlers were unloading their lives here, the line through Millet was already operating under the Canadian Pacific Railway. It carried people north with their livestock, tools, seed, furniture, and whatever else they could pack into a rail car. However, the railway could only bring them to the edge of a new life. It could not make them landowners. That part came from the government. For $10, a settler could claim 160 acres of land. It sounded simple enough. A small payment, a quarter section, and a chance to begin again. But claiming the land was the easy part. Keeping it, well, that was a different story. A settler had to prove they could live there, build something, work the ground, and make it produce. Some stayed on the land year-round and tried to earn their land title quickly. Others took the longer route, living on the land for a portion of each year, making improvements over time. Either way, there was no shortcut. The railway brought them in, the government offered the land. But after that, it came down to weather, work, and time. There was no guarantee of success. Just 160 acres, $10, and a deadline. After the land was claimed, well, the work began. Homesteads started sprouting up around the railway, and as more families settled onto the land, Millet had little choice but to grow with them. Ben Slaughter, a fur buyer, was among the first to settle here in the early 1890s. He had a store with living quarters on the east side of the railway, and by 1896, Millet's first post office was operating out of that store. That may not sound like much, but on the prairie, a store and a post office, well, that meant something. It meant people had a place to collect mail, buy supplies, exchange news, and begin forming the routines of a community. By 1901, there were already several buildings here. The next year, B.A. Van Meter built a store, and the Millet Hotel came into existence. Then, in 1903, Millet was officially organized as a community. It was still small, still muddy, still tied to the railway in almost every way. But it was no longer just a stop on the line. It was becoming a place people expected to last. And by 1911, the population had doubled from 75 to more than 150 residents. The farms came first, but slowly around them, the town began to take shape. By the 1920s, this place wasn't just receiving goods, it was also sending them out. One of the most remarkable examples came in the winter months, with fish from Pigeon Lake. This wasn't local trade, this was a timed run. Around midnight, the teams were already moving, not along paved roads, but over winter trails, horse-drawn sleighs cutting through the dark towards the fish plant at Mulhurst. They had to be at the plant no later than 6 in the morning. The fish were then packed into boxes with ice ready to be loaded. Each box weighed approximately 200 pounds. Roughly 42 boxes went onto each sleigh. Then they turned around and headed back to Millet, carrying thousands of pounds of fish across the frozen countryside, heading towards the rail station. And by 7 o'clock that evening, they were already on their way south, headed to markets as far as New York and Chicago. Everything depended on timing, and everything depended on the line. Inside the station, the agent handled more than just freight. He handled messages, telegrams, news from the outside world. During the war years, people watched the agent closely. He was often the one who carried telegrams into town. If he walked through the streets whistling, people felt a sense of relief. It usually meant the message wasn't bad. But if he wasn't whistling, well, people noticed. Because the railway didn't just bring goods into town. It brought in news. And during wartime, that news could change a family's life in a single moment. For decades, everything pointed to the tracks, but slowly that began to change. The old trail between Calgary and Edmonton had already been shifting over time, adjusting around sloughs and rough ground. And as the preferred mode of transportation was beginning to change, the road moved to the west side of the railway, and by the late 1930s, it was improved and paved. With better roads came more automobiles, more independence, and less reliance on the train. Little by little, the routines that had once shaped daily life here began to disappear. People no longer walked to the station each evening the way they once had. They no longer gathered just to see who had arrived, who left, and what news had come in on the train. By the 1970s, the station itself, the building that had anchored the community for decades, was sold and eventually demolished. But you can still see its influence here, in the way the town was shaped, in the layout of the streets. Millet didn't begin as a planned community. It began as a stop along the railway line, in a low, muddy stretch of the prairie, but that stop became an anchor. Around that stop came a station, stores, homes, churches, and schools, and daily routines of a growing community. What began as a place to pause became a place to stay. And from that point on the line, well, Millet grew.
Magnolia town was humming, smoke lay on the ground. Yeah, Magnolia town was humming, smoke lay on the ground. Ain't no face I recognize, and my baby can't be found. I left that place in summer, swore I'd be back by fall. I left that place in summer, swore I'd be back by fall. Now the porch is bare and broken, and her name's gone from the wall. Church bell moaning down on Beale Street side. Heard the church bell moaning down on Beale Street side. Sounded like forgiveness for the tears I try to hide. Now I'm sitting with this guitar, strings hum like they know. Yeah, sitting with this guitar, strings hum like they know. When love don't live no longer, that blues is all you own.
Onoway is a small town in Alberta, about 60 kilometers northwest of Edmonton. The town itself took shape in the early 1900s as settlement pushed into this part of the province, following federal prairie land surveys in the late 1890s. Farm families arrived first, taking up quarter sections and working the land that was well suited for grain, hay, and mixed farming. From the very beginning, it functioned as a service and market center for the surrounding agricultural district, a place where crops could be shipped, supplies gathered, and daily life supported. To put that into context, here's a look at Onoway today. The landscape around town still reflects its purpose, surrounded by farmland, fields of grain, and pasture which stretches out in every direction, much as it did more than a century ago. Agriculture wasn't just an influence here, it shaped how town was formed and how it endured. By 1904, the establishment of a post office marked the first permanent piece of community infrastructure, signaling a shift from scattered homesteads to an organized settlement. It provided a central point for communication and basic services, helping anchor the area as more families arrived. What followed wasn't rapid growth, but gradual practical development. The town expanded as needs required, shaped by agriculture and the surrounding district, rather than ambition or speculation. That steady pace of growth remains a defining characteristic of Onoway today. By the mid-20th century, more than 1,600 traditional wooden grain elevators stood across Alberta, forming what became known as the Prairie Skyline. Built by line elevator companies, many were later absorbed as the grain industry consolidated. After the 1960s, rail-based grain handling declined, and trucking grain became dominant, and soon after, most small-town elevators were dismantled or demolished. In Onoway, we see one grain elevator, purchased privately in 1993. It still stands today, no longer part of the grain system, but continuing to serve a purpose in the community. Onoway was incorporated as a village in 1909 and became a town in 1941. As its population peaked in the early post-war years, Onoway sat just under 1,200 residents. Today, the town's population is roughly around 1,000 people, a number that has remained surprisingly stable over the last several decades. Now, as you move through town, the street layout reflects that early planning. The commercial core is compact and functional, designed for foot traffic and short distances rather than sprawl. By the 1920s, Onoway was no longer just a service point for farms. It was becoming a fully functional town, with businesses that handled not only grain and supplies, but food production, vehicle repair, lumberyards, and retail. One of the most important early industries here was dairy. In 1923, Onoway's first creamery, known as Spring Dairy Creamery, was built about a mile northeast of town. It operated only briefly, closing in 1926, but it demonstrated something important. Local production mattered enough to invest in processing, not just shipping raw goods elsewhere. That idea carried forward. So in 1926, a new creamery opened right in town, on the south side of Railway Ave east of 49th Street, operating under a new name, Pure Butter. When the building burned in 1942, it was rebuilt almost immediately, as a sign of how essential that operation had become. The rebuilt creamery opened in 1942-43, first as Woodland Dairy, and later, in 1948, under the Northern Alberta Dairy Pool. For decades, butter, cheese, and ice cream weren't shipped in. They were made here. It wasn't until 1973 that production stopped, and the building became a receiving station. A few years passed, and that was closed as well, and eventually the building was demolished. Onoway Hardware, built before 1921 on lots 8 and 9 of Block 1, served the town for more than 70 years. From the 1920s until 1993, It wasn't just a hardware store. At various times, parts of the building functioned as a restaurant, a drugstore, and even a dance hall for special occasions. Construction materials mattered as well. The first lumber yard in Onoway opened before 1921, later becoming Beaver Lumber, which served the community for 47 years. Managers came and went, but the yard remained a constant, supplying homes, barns, shops, and repairs as the town matured. This is Onoway's Hotel, built in 1927 by Sidney Beert. You see, a hotel wasn't just for travelers. It was where meetings happened, deals were made, and people passed through with the railway. Nearly 100 years later, it's still anchoring the street, the same way it always has. The building that became Eddie Dale's general store began as a small shop in the early 1920s. After Eddie made the purchase in 1950, it expanded rapidly, the last edition coming in 1967. For 35 years, it was a fixture of daily life here. When Eddie moved to a new building in 1980, the original structure was demolished. Between 1954 and 1957, concrete sidewalks were poured, and large sums of money were spent on graveling streets. Paving didn't arrive until around 1980. This wasn't rushed development. It happened when the town could afford it and when it made sense. And that's just a part of Onoway's early history. Buildings were replaced, streets were improved, services moved, and industries changed. But through it all, Onoway never really lost the feeling of a small Alberta town, built to serve the people around it. When you drive through the streets here, you can still see pieces of its story. The older buildings, open spaces, and the way town still fits the land around it. Onoway changed, as every town does. Yet it kept enough of itself that the past still feels close. People have always been on the move. At first it was on foot, then by horse and wagon, later by rail. The West didn't open up all at once. When the railway came through here, it changed what felt possible. The time it took to travel the distance between A and B shrank. Moving goods became easier. Stopping suddenly made sense and towns formed because of it. Yes, today we move differently. Roads, for the most part, have replaced the rails. We still follow opportunity. We still build along the paths that make life easier. Rumsey is one of those places shaped by that movement, first by the railway and later by what happened after it was gone. This is Rumsey. It's small, spread out, and quiet. Most of what's here reflects what town needed to be, not what it hoped to become. Rumsey begins to take shape in the early 1900s. A post office opened in 1908, which is usually a good sign that people were already established in the area and were planning to stay. In 1912, the railway had arrived, a third-class station on the Canadian Northern Line. That connection mattered. Grain moved out by rail, supplies moved in, and Rumsey became a service point for the farms surrounding it. For decades, that system worked. The elevator was central. The school brought families together. The hall hosted meetings, dances, and winter events. People came into town when they needed to, then went back to the land. and life here followed the seasons more than the clock. As transportation changed, Rumsey changed with it. Grain handling became centralized, elevators closed, trucks replaced rail cars. By the late 1990s, the rail itself was abandoned and the tracks were removed. The infrastructure that once justified a station here was simply no longer needed. In 1995, Rumsey's status shifted from village to hamlet. Now this wasn't a dramatic moment, just an acknowledgement that town was smaller than it once had been. What's important here is that it didn't disappear, it adjusted. Today, Rumsey's population sits around 60 people, give or take a few. There's no commercial main street, there's no real crime. Rumsey's like many rural communities. It's quiet more than anything else. Real estate reflects that reality. Homes here are affordable compared to much of the province. People don't come here chasing growth. They come here because they want space, quiet, and a connection to the countryside. There's a small library here and it holds a surprising amount of local knowledge. I stopped in and picked up a book called Pioneer Days, which documents the families who settled this area, where they came from and how they lived, and what it took to build a life here. It's not grand history, it's everyday history, and in a place like this, that matters more. In 2019, Rumsey quietly marked its centennial. Former residents returned. Photos were shared, stories resurfaced. A simple acknowledgement of 100 years of life here. Driving through here today, you're not seeing a town waiting to be rediscovered. You're seeing a place that has already made adjustments when the railway left, and it found a way to keep going on a smaller, quieter scale. In 1909, the Canadian prairie was a map of empty squares and quiet promises. For $10 and the strength to break 10 acres of sod each year, the Dominion government offered a man and his family a future. It was a simple agreement on paper, but one that carried real weight out on the open land. However, there was a catch. The government retained the minerals, the oil, and the deeper resources beneath the surface. What they did offer was the soil itself, a thin layer a man could work with his hands, and in a place like Youngstown, even that could prove uncertain. Yet, still, people came. They arrived with teams and wagons, with what they could carry, and with the belief that something lasting could be built out here. This is the story of a town that rose quickly, grew beyond expectations, and then slowly gave way to the realities of the land that surrounded it. This is Youngstown. Before the railway arrived in this area, Youngstown existed only as a set of lines on a map. When Alberta became a province in 1905, the federal government continued to control the land, administering it through a network of land offices. These offices became the starting point for anyone hoping to claim a piece of the prairie. The process itself was straightforward, well, at least in theory. To start off, a settler would walk into a land office and request information about available land. The clerk would provide a map, marking out the open sections. From there, the real work began. Men would head out onto the open prairie, often traveling for miles across the open ground, guided by a compass, judgment, and a little bit of luck. They were looking for survey markers, or small mounds of earth. At the center of each mound was an iron stake, driven deep into the ground and stamped with the legal description of that particular quarter section. And they weren't always easy to find. Some stakes had gone missing, whether by accident or by design, no one can really say for certain. There were frequent claims that ranchers who had grown used to open grazing on the land would remove the markers to make settlement more difficult. Whatever the reason, it meant that finding your land often required patience, persistence, and a fair amount of guesswork. But once a man was confident in what he had found, everything became urgent. He would return to the land office as quickly as possible, pay his $10, and file his claim before someone else could step in ahead of him. From that moment, the responsibility began. He had 6 months to begin living on the land. Over the next 3 years, he was required to build a home that could be considered livable and to break enough of the prairie sod to prove that the land could be worked. When the time came, those efforts would be confirmed not just by officials but by neighbors, men who had gone through the same process themselves. There was another approach available to some. After the South African War, veterans were granted land scrip, entitlements to 320 acres. Many chose not to settle and instead sold their claims. So by 1911, the movement into the district had begun in earnest. With the tracks ending at Castor, this was the starting point for most. Wagons pushed out across the open sod, loaded with materials like lumber, hardware, and windows for a town that had yet to take shape. At this point, there was no tracks yet, no true town center, only the idea of one, and the work required to make it real. In 1912, with the arrival of the Canadian Northern Railway, everything shifted. Buildings that once stood scattered across the prairies were moved closer to the tracks, drawn towards the survey lines that now defined the future of the area. What had been a loose settlement and somewhat scattered had quickly reorganized itself into something more structured, and then, almost immediately, it began to grow. Freight arrived in steady volume. Lumber for construction, machinery for farms, coal for heating, groceries, fencing wire, everything that was required to support both a town and the surrounding district. Before the railway, supplies had taken days to haul in by wagon. Now, they arrived regularly and in greater quantities. The change was immediate, and it was dramatic. The streets began to fill in as new businesses appeared, one after another. Town took on the look of a place that expected to last. By 1922, Youngstown had grown into something remarkable for its location. There were multiple hotels, multiple livery barns, hardware stores, and general stores, even a department store that operated alongside the smaller shops. There were doctors, a dentist, a veterinarian, and even legal offices, a theater that showed films, and a weekly newspaper that kept the residents informed. At its peak, town had 7 grain elevators, along with their annexes that stood along the tracks, handling the harvests that came in from the surrounding farms. At the center of it all was the United Grain Growers Elevator, built in 1914. It handled tens of thousands of bushels in those early years, alongside shipments of coal, livestock, and other supplies. The population here rose quickly, passing 700. Schools expanded, churches were built and filled. The town took on the confidence of a place that believed it had a secure future. For a time, it seemed that everything was working exactly as intended. If you reside in the West, then you understand that the prairie runs at its own pace and has its own limits. Now, those early years had included good harvests. Crops in 1915 and 16 had been strong enough to build confidence across the district. That confidence carried forward even as conditions began to change. Then, the dry years returned. Rain became less reliable, and the crops, they weakened. By the late 1920s, the wind itself began to reshape the land. Dust storms rolled across the fields, lifting the topsoil and carrying it away. What had once become fertile ground became exposed and fragile, vulnerable to every shift in the weather. And if that wasn't bad enough, then came the grasshoppers. In certain years, they arrived in numbers that were difficult to comprehend, moving across fields in waves, stripping crops down to nothing in a matter of hours. Farmers tried to respond however they could, plowing trenches and laying poison bait in an effort to slow the spread. But there was only so much that could be done. As the land began to fail, so did the finances that supported it. Municipal resources were stretched thin. The Sounding Creek Municipal District, which once operated out of Youngstown, struggled to maintain services like roads, pest control, and relief efforts while they became increasingly difficult to sustain. For many families, the decision became unavoidable. They were going to have to leave. Some moved to more stable farming regions, others left agriculture altogether. Businesses that had depended on the growing population could no longer survive. Stores closed, lumber yards shut down, buildings that had once been part of a busy town stood empty. By 1937, the population had dropped to roughly 100 residents. That same year, Youngstown lost its town status and was reduced to once again being a village. In 1938, the provincial government established the Special Areas Board, an effort to manage the regions most heavily affected by drought and economic collapse. Youngstown became the operational heart of Special Area Number 2. This wasn't just an administrative change. It was a unique Alberta designation that marked this territory as a recovery zone, a badge of endurance for those who refused to leave. Town soon began to take on a different role. The agricultural school was repurposed as a maintenance and repair facility for road equipment. Government workers, along with ranchers who adapted to the changing conditions, became the backbone of the local population. How the land in the district was used shifted. Where crops had once been uncertain, grazing proved more reliable. The focus moved away from farming and moved towards something that could better withstand the realities of the region. Over time, the town stabilized, and improvements came slowly but steadily. Sewer service was introduced in 1958, and new homes appeared. even as many of the original businesses from the boom years disappeared. Some structures remained, though movement was quieter than before. Churches that had once been full saw fewer congregations. Then, in 1976, one of the final physical connections to the town's beginnings was removed. The Canadian National Depot, the building that had anchored Youngstown since the arrival of the railway, was demolished and burned. There was no ceremony. It was simply no longer needed, and still the town remained. Today, this village stands as a place shaped by both expectation and reality. It did not become a city, as it once imagined to be. But it also did not disappear. What remains is something quieter, but not less significant. A community that adapted, endured, and found a way to continue, even after the conditions that built this place changed. And out here, that may be the truest measure of success. Hey, my name is Mike. If you've been enjoying these prairie stories, these places, and their forgotten history, consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It really does help the channel grow and keeps these stories reaching more people. And if you're deep into the Prairie Pride, then consider joining the membership. This supports my work directly and helps keep these projects moving forward. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your support. Take care.